Ser nueva en Northwood High, en Maryland, para mi tercer año se sintió particularmente difícil. No conocer a nadie fue definitivamente un desafío. A esa altura todos ya tenían sus círculos sociales establecidos. La peor parte, sin embargo, era la hora del almuerzo. La política de nuestra escuela no permitía a los de tercer año salir del campus para almorzar. Ese privilegio estaba reservado únicamente para los de cuarto año, así que estaba atrapada comiendo en la cafetería. Realmente lo temía, anticipando que no tendría dónde sentarme y sintiéndome incómoda al intentar unirme a una mesa al azar. Cuando finalmente llegó la hora del almuerzo, entré en la bulliciosa cafetería, llevando mi bandeja, buscando un lugar abierto. Cada una de las mesas estaba ocupada. Sentarse sola ni siquiera era una opción. Sin embargo, arrinconada en un rincón había una mesa con solo 2 chicos sentados allí. Parecía el lugar menos intimidante disponible. Me dirigí hacia ellos y les pregunté si podía unirme. Intercambiaron una rápida mirada y uno asintió y dijo, «Claro». Mientras me sentaba me di cuenta de que se parecían sorprendentemente, quizás hermanos o parientes cercanos, tal vez con algo de herencia mediterránea, aunque hablaban sin ningún acento discernible. Parecían bastante decentes. Se presentaron como Víctor y Marcus y conversaron conmigo. Incluso sugirieron pasar el rato más tarde ese día después de la escuela. Honestamente pensé, ¿por qué no? Necesitaba empezar en algún lugar si quería hacer conexiones. Obtuve su información de contacto y después de la escuela me fui a casa para dejar mis cosas. Poco tiempo después recibí un mensaje de texto de Marcus diciendo que él y su hermano estaban haciendo planes. Sugirió encontrarse alrededor de las 9 p.m. esa noche cerca de un parque local que estaba a unos 15 minutos a pie de mi casa. Mencionó que había un lugar genial cerca que querían mostrarme. Como el primer día de escuela fue un viernes, el día siguiente era libre. No tenía nada planeado, así que acepté, diciendo que estaba dispuesta. Cuando se acercó la hora, Marcus me envió un mensaje de texto por última vez para confirmar si seguía viniendo. Respondí que salía en unos minutos y verifiqué que nos encontraríamos en el camino que bordea el parque. Él confirmó, así que comencé mi caminata a la tenue luz hacia la zona del parque. Cuanto más caminaba, más me encontraba pensando en mi reciente reubicación y la extrañeza de ser la chica nueva. Me di cuenta de que literalmente caminaba hacia una zona de parque a altas horas de la noche para pasar el rato con 2 chicos que acababa de conocer horas antes. De todos modos, llegué al pequeño sendero al lado del límite del parque y le envié un mensaje de texto a Marcus preguntando dónde estaban. Él respondió rápidamente diciendo que estaban un poco fuera del sendero, pasando el rato cerca de un pequeño estanque que querían mostrarme, ubicado dentro del bosque junto al parque. Then he promptly sent his location via text. I made my way into the woods, pushing aside branches, using my older phone's weak light as my only illumination. I started calling out for Marcus and Victor, feeling like I must be close based on the shared location. Suddenly I heard footfalls. I stopped dead. Definitely footsteps approaching me. They were quiet and slow. I called out, telling them they'd better not be trying to pull a prank, but they didn't answer. I decided this whole situation was foolish. I turned around and started walking back towards the path. Those footsteps I'd heard, they went from quiet and slow to fast. Before I could even react, someone had an arm wrapped tightly around my neck, cutting off my breath effectively. I heard a familiar voice yell, "Hold him! Hold him!" I managed to break free from the partial chokehold and sprinted back towards the path. I sensed they followed me right up to the edge of the woods near the path. I was faster than them, and I could run for a long distance, which is exactly what I did. I ran straight home and immediately told my parents. They thought about contacting the authorities, but I suggested it might be better to photograph the mark left on my neck and report it to the school the following day. That's what we decided to do. With the texts I'd received from Marcus serving as evidence, I was able to get both students removed from the school. My parents insisted I block their contact numbers. I didn't put up any argument about that. My parents were concerned about them knowing our address, and I told them honestly that I didn't believe they did as far as I was aware. Anyway, about a week or so later, late one evening, I woke up feeling very cold in my room. I heard the sound of wind rushing in and looked towards the window to see it was wide open. I wondered if my mother had come in and opened it, but that made no sense at all. It was around 40 degrees Fahrenheit outside that night. I walked over to it and looked down. Just below my bedroom window, there's a part of the house exterior that extends outward, creating a kind of ledge underneath, which my father had always told me to use as an escape route in case of a fire. I shut the window securely and walked over to my parents' bedroom. I knocked softly and opened the door. My mother, half asleep, asked what was wrong. I had to ask her if she had opened my window. She sat up fully, saying, "No, why?" I told her again, my voice louder and more worried, that my window was completely open and someone else must have done it. She started nudging my father awake to get him to check my room with me. But when he woke up, he just told me to stop being dramatic and go back to sleep. I left my parents' door ajar as I walked back down the corridor towards my room. As I did, I noticed something that surprised me. My own door seemed to be halfway closed now when it had been fully open when I left it moments ago. I pushed the door open just slightly so I could peek through the gap and see if someone was hiding behind the door. Although the possibility had crossed my mind, I never genuinely expected to see it. There was someone concealed behind my door. I screamed for my father like a small child. I screamed so loud I'm sure it could be heard several houses down the street. My door suddenly slammed shut just as my father came rushing out of his room towards me. I yelled, "There are people in my room!" So he burst into the room and flicked on the light switch. At that moment, we saw the lower half of a person disappearing out my window. My father ran to the window, then dashed downstairs and out the front door to try and pursue them. But he came back a few minutes later, breathless, saying he hadn't seen anyone, fueled by adrenaline and fear. I was certain it had to be one or both of those kids I'd gotten expelled. My father contacted the police, and I had to recount the entire story to them when they arrived, going back to the incident in the woods. My father corroborated my account. However, without concrete proof of who had entered the house, they stated there wasn't much they could do legally. They simply advised us to keep our doors locked and consider installing security cameras outside. Despite my absolute certainty that it was either one of or both of those two students in my room that night, nothing of this nature ever occurred again after enduring several months of sleeping on edge. Looking back now, I still question why I was so willing to meet those guys in the woods at night in the first place. I really should have recognized in the cafeteria earlier that day that they seemed like potential trouble and just stayed away. In my first year of high school back in 2009, during the last period, which was physical education, we had a replacement teacher. It was one of the stormiest days of the year. The substitute was an older man, not elderly, but clearly gray-haired, perhaps around 55 to 60 years old. As he took attendance, when he got to my name, he paused and did a double take, staring at me. I found it slightly unsettling, though I admit, without trying to sound boastful, I'd always been told I looked older and quite good for a freshman in high school. The substitute instructed us to get into our basketball teams, and then he vanished into the hallway near the changing rooms for a considerable time. 40 minutes elapsed, and the period was drawing to a close. It was time for us to get dressed and head home. I went into the girls' changing room, but for some reason my locker wouldn't open. I repeated my usual combination over and over, but it simply wouldn't click open. I had to approach the substitute teacher and inform him, asking if he could retrieve my combination from the records. I thought perhaps my usual sequence had just temporarily slipped my mind. The substitute told me to give him a few minutes and he would get the list of locker combinations. I waited outside the school office, and eventually he emerged carrying a book open to a specific page. He walked into the girls' changing room with me, which I hadn't anticipated. The changing room was practically empty by then, with only one other girl finishing up getting dressed. He walked over to my locker and tried the combination written down on the paper. It didn't work, no matter how many times he attempted it. Each time he tried and failed, he would look at me and chuckle nervously. I forced myself to laugh along, trying to be polite. That's when things started feeling genuinely strange. He placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "Don't worry, we'll get this." He tried the combination again with his hand still resting on my shoulder, and it failed once more. I felt his hand slowly begin to move downwards, from my shoulder towards my lower back. I instinctively pulled away and grabbed my school bag, saying, "It's okay, I'm really late for my bus." He attempted the combination on the locker one final time, and this time it opened. He gave a brief smile and walked away. I waited until I heard the changing room door close behind him and then proceeded to get dressed as quickly as possible. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness. I finished pulling up my trousers and quickly shoved my belongings into the locker in the dark. I threw my backpack on and started making my way towards the back exit of the changing room, which led outside. I had a growing fear that the substitute might be waiting right by the door for me. I was getting a distinctly predatory vibe from him. When I reached the end of the specific aisle of lockers I was in, I was at the intersection of two rows. I needed to turn left to get to the exit door, but naturally I glanced to the right first, just to make sure the way was clear. There was a faint glimmer of light filtering in from a single rectangular window set high near the ceiling. It was just enough light for me to see him. He was peering at me from around the corner of the locker wall. That's when I just bolted for the exit door. He came rushing up behind me saying, "Oh, wait, it's not what it looks like." I ran outside into the pouring rain off the school grounds and walked the rest of the way home. That walk gave me time to process what had just happened. By the time I arrived home completely soaked, it dawned on me. He most likely had somehow altered my locker combination earlier as a deliberate way of being alone with me in the changing room. As for what he might have intended to do when he turned off the lights, I've honestly never wanted to allow myself to imagine it. The truth is, I was too emotionally shaken and frankly too mortified to tell anyone about it. Not even my parents or closest friends. It was something I've simply kept to myself all these years because, quite truthfully, I still don't feel comfortable discussing it with people. When I was in secondary school, I was part of the music program. At my school, the band was essentially one of the main options available for a creative subject, alongside orchestra or choir. So I opted for the band. Our band director, Mr. Harrison, had a straightforward grading system. As long as you attended class and completed your required weekly practice sessions, you'd earn an A. Sadly, near the end of one term, I had missed 2 of those practice sessions. Consequently, my grade was hovering at a B. I approached him after class to ask if there was any way I could make up the missed practices. Although he seemed hesitant at first, he agreed to let me come in during a lunch break and practice in one of the downstairs storage areas to get credit for a session. I was perfectly happy with that arrangement, primarily because, realistically, I probably just planned to play games on my phone anyway instead of genuinely practicing. I arrived at the main music room area during my designated lunch period the following day, collected my percussion instrument, and headed down the stairs located outside the music room towards the basement section of the music department. It always felt a bit eerie down there, as virtually no one apart from the music instructors ever went down there typically, and the lighting was rather poor. I had only been down there a couple of times before that day. Anyway, I walked down the hallway, and on either side were numerous doors leading into small rooms perhaps around 6 by 6 feet in size. These rooms were used for keeping various items like seats, instrument stands, spare instruments, concert props, and whatever else needed storing. I stepped into one of the rooms and closed the door behind me. I set up my practice stand and some sheet music just in case Mr. Harrison happened to come downstairs to check up on me, but truly, I had no intention of actually practicing. I started playing games on my phone, and then total darkness. It was as dark as it could possibly get, except for the small glow from my phone screen. I instinctively glanced over at the light switch for the room and flicked it up and down a few times, but that did nothing. I stumbled slightly as I got up from my seat to open the door, only to find more darkness in the hallway. I held my phone out in front of me to provide a little light for the hallway, even if it was just a weak illumination. I think I had an older type of smartphone back then, and those models didn't have proper flashlights built in. Nevertheless, that faint glow from my phone was enough to see that one of the doors near the far end of the hall was slightly ajar. Then I heard something being dragged within that room like one of the large, heavy equipment trunks. There was also agitated breathing followed by low, animal-like grunts. Following that, I saw a large equipment trunk being pushed out of that room into the hallway. The moment I saw this, I quickly turned off my phone screen. I retreated back into the room I had just been in. I closed the door as quietly as I possibly could. I'm not entirely sure what my reasoning was in that exact moment for deciding to conceal myself. But I think the combination of the peculiar sounds I was hearing from this person and the sudden power cut made me extremely wary of remaining in the hallway. Whoever it was, they were positioned near the stairwell, effectively blocking my exit, and of course I had zero phone reception down in that little basement area. The only course of action I felt safe taking was to stay put in that room and wait, hoping the lights would eventually come back on. But the lights seemed like they were never going to return. So after a period of waiting, I decided I would attempt to get back upstairs again. I quietly opened the door with my phone held out in front of me for minimal light. Then, I stepped into the hallway. I crept forward a little closer towards where the stairs were located, and I heard something again. I quickly slipped into the very next closest room that had its door slightly open and closed it gently. I still wasn't certain who or what I was hiding from. Could it have been a staff member or a custodian? At that point, the only reason I had to suspect it might not be was because they only seemed to appear down there after the power had been cut. I stood in that room in complete darkness, relying solely on listening and waiting for any further sound from outside. But you know how, when you're in a confined space with someone else, even if you don't explicitly hear them, you can sometimes just sense their presence. That's the feeling that suddenly came over me standing in that pitch-black room. I raised my trembling hand and pressed the home button on my phone to turn on the screen for just a fraction of a second. That fleeting light was enough. I saw someone standing in the corner of this small storage room less than a meter away from me. I quickly pretended I hadn't seen anything, but it was too late. That's what I heard next, breaking the silence. Then a hand patted my shoulder twice and started to squeeze. I essentially lunged for the doorknob, fumbling to locate it at first, but managing to pull the door open when I did. The person in the room with me tried to push the door shut after I opened it, but I was already scrambling out. I ran frantically up the stairs and burst out the door onto the main level of the music area, where the lights were still fully on. I ran straight to Mr. Harrison, out of breath, and recounted what had happened. He promptly called security to check the basement section of the music department. However, the security personnel came back upstairs reporting that aside from some music equipment being rearranged, there was no one down there. For the rest of the period, Mr. Harrison canceled his planned trumpet lesson, and I sat there in the room with him and about 5 trumpet players, explaining the entire story in meticulous detail. Without any surveillance cameras in the music area, there was ultimately no way of identifying whoever had gone down there and cut the power to the basement. It seemed most likely they were attempting to steal expensive music equipment, and goodness knows what else they might have been planning. The following day, I was summoned to the dean's office to formally give my account of what occurred, and as they say, the rest is history. One night, my friends and I concocted a rather ingenious scheme. Our idea was to gain entry to the high school basement through a specific ground-level window that was known to be broken and never properly repaired. The particular detail about accessing this window was that you had to climb over a low metal fence surrounding the exterior steps that led down to the basement level. While it certainly wouldn't have effectively stopped anyone determined to get in, it did provide that extra little obstacle that made you feel like you were engaging in something truly mischievous once you climbed over it. We made sure there were no patrol vehicles from campus security anywhere nearby. Then we hopped the fence. Crawling in through the window proved to be a bit challenging, considering we had to boost each other up and then squeeze through an incredibly narrow opening. But once we were inside, we were in. We kind of spread out from each other to explore different sections of the basement. One thing became immediately clear: the school basement was in a state of disarray and was anything but interesting. There was minimal light. Just one small, dim white light fixture was on in a far corner, and surprisingly, the glow from the emergency exit signs actually provided more illumination than you'd think. I was looking around when I spotted one of my friends nearby. He whispered, "Let's go upstairs." So I followed him back towards the stairs, and he opened the door leading up to the school's main hallway. Everything was completely dark. I had always assumed there were at least some lights left on in the school building at night. But no, not a single light was illuminated. And all that really stood out, as far as the eye could see, were the various exit signs glowing red. I followed my friend down the hall and remember saying something like, "Man, this is really creepy." And he responded dismissively, like it was no big deal. He didn't realize just yet, nor did I. I followed my friend towards the restroom, and he went into one of the stalls. I whispered impatiently, "Hurry up." I waited for a while, then my phone started to ring. I answered it, and it was one of my other friends, Mark. He asked, "Where on earth did you go?" I told him I was upstairs with either Ryan or Scott, the names of my other friends. He replied, "Well, what are you talking about? They're right here with me." And right after, both Scott and Ryan said hello, apparently on speakerphone. I stammered out the word, "I," and stopped, desperately trying to make sense of things. Then there was a sound. Laughter coming from the stall, not the laugh of any of my friends. I looked up towards the stall. There was someone looking over the top of it at me, likely standing on the toilet seat. I screamed something like, "Oh my God," over and over into the phone as I scrambled out of the restroom. Shortly after I got out, I heard the stall door slam shut behind me. I tried to race back towards the basement entrance in the dark, but it wasn't easy to locate without any light. Luckily, I managed to find it. So I started yelling their names as I ran down the stairs. I yelled, "Let's go, let's go." When they answered, we quickly, one by one, jumped off some kind of bucket onto the window ledge and crawled back outside. I was the first one out, primarily afraid that the person from the restroom was following me. Once we were all outside, I explained to them, still breathless but also now laughing, feeling safe with them all next to me. I guess we were making quite a bit of noise or something, though, because as we all just started looking around at the entire school building and scanning all the classroom windows, in one of the downstairs windows, we saw someone with their hands pressed against the glass. You could only see maybe half of their face. I said, "That's got to be him," as Ryan urged us to get the heck out of there immediately. We ran until we were well off the premises of the school property, and that was the end of it. We brainstormed a lot of possible explanations later, but honestly, none of them really made any coherent sense. Obviously, we never attempted anything like that again after that night.